My name is Willa and I'm 45 years old. My life, from the outside, might seem perfectly ordinary now. I live in a quiet suburban house with a garden I tend meticulously, my days filled with the simple rhythm of work, community, and the occasional visit from friends. But for years my life was anything but ordinary. It was a suffocating quiet, a carefully constructed silence built on the fear of what might happen if I ever truly let my voice ring out. The air in our house was thick with unspoken rules, the most potent of which was this: do not make waves. And every single time, without fail, if I dared to raise my voice, to express frustration, anger, or even a strong opinion, I was met with the same chilling phrase: look who you're becoming. It wasn't a question, but an accusation, a judgment thrown at me by the people who were supposed to love me most. It was their ultimate weapon, designed to shackle me to a past I barely remembered, a ghost they conjured from their own anxieties. And it worked. For years I stayed quiet. I swallowed my words, choked back my feelings, and perfected the art of the agreeable nod. I became a master of suppression, believing that peace, however fragile, was preferable to the chaos their words threatened. But there's only so long a person can live without their own voice before they start to disappear. This is the story of how I found my way back from the silence, of how I finally stopped looking at who they thought I was becoming, and started looking at who I truly was. If you've ever felt silenced, ever felt the weight of unspoken words, this story is for you. My earliest memories are tinged with a quiet tension, a pervasive sense that something was always just beneath the surface, ready to erupt. Our family home was a museum of unspoken emotions, each room holding a silent history. My mother, beautiful and fragile, moved through life like a ghost, her face often etched with a sorrow I couldn't comprehend. My father, a man of few words, communicated mostly through his actions, or inactions which spoke volumes. And then there was my older brother, David, who seemed to have absorbed all the family's anxieties, radiating a nervous energy that kept us all on edge. I was the youngest, the observer, perpetually trying to decipher the unwritten script of our lives. I remember one particular afternoon. I must have been around 10. I was frustrated with David. He'd broken my favorite doll, a porcelain beauty with ringlets I adored. My voice, usually soft, rose in a wail of indignation. "You broke her. You broke my doll," I cried, tears streaming down my face. Before I could even finish, my mother's hand was on my arm, her grip surprisingly firm. "Willa," she whispered, her eyes wide with a familiar fear. "Look who you're becoming. Don't be like her." Her. The word hung in the air, a phantom presence. I knew who she meant, though I never truly understood why. It was my Aunt Carol, my mother's estranged sister, a woman spoken of only in hushed, disapproving tones. Aunt Carol was the problematic one, the one who spoke her mind too freely, who challenged conventions, who dared to be different. The doll was forgotten. The tears dried. All that mattered was the sudden, crushing weight of their disapproval, the unspoken threat of becoming her. From that day on, a seed of caution was planted deep within me. Every time I felt a strong emotion bubbling up, a voice in my head, a replica of my mother's whisper, would say, "Look who you're becoming." And I would swallow it back down. A subtle chill began to permeate the house, a quiet agreement among us to keep the peace at any cost. The silence became my constant companion, a heavy cloak I wore everywhere. As I grew, so did the list of things I couldn't say, the opinions I couldn't voice. At school, I was the quiet one, the good student who never caused trouble. My teachers praised my calm demeanor, never realizing it was a carefully constructed facade. At home, family dinners were a silent ballet of polite conversation, carefully sidestepping any topic that might lead to disagreement. If my father made a comment I found unfair, or my mother expressed a prejudiced view, I would feel a surge of protest, a burning sensation behind my eyes. But then I'd hear it, the echo of "look who you're becoming." And I'd bite my tongue, the words turning to ash in my mouth. David, my brother, became the family's designated peacekeeper, the one who would crack a joke or change the subject if the conversation veered too close to anything contentious. He, too, seemed to have internalized the fear of her. I remember one evening, I was a teenager, brimming with newfound idealism. I'd just read a book about social justice and was passionate about a particular issue. I tentatively brought it up at dinner, eager to discuss it, to share my newfound convictions. My father, who rarely engaged in such discussions, simply grunted. My mother, however, met my gaze with that familiar, almost mournful look. "Willa," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "you're getting so worked up. You sound just like She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The unspoken her hung in the air, a heavy shroud. The passion drained out of me, replaced by a familiar shame. I excused myself from the table, the half-eaten dinner turning to sawdust in my mouth. I went to my room, not to cry, but to sit in the quiet darkness, practicing silence. I realized then that their fear wasn't just about Aunt Carol. It was about any strong emotion, any deviation from their prescribed path of quiet conformity. It was about controlling me, shaping me into a version of myself that wouldn't disturb their carefully balanced world. And I was letting them. Each unsaid word was a brick in the wall I was building around myself, trapping my true voice inside. The silence grew heavier, but a quiet, almost imperceptible shift began to stir beneath the surface of my compliant exterior. Years turned into decades. I went to college, got a job, built a life that seemed perfectly normal to everyone around me. But the silence, my self-imposed prison, came with me. I avoided confrontation, diffused arguments, and became the ultimate people-pleaser. My relationships, both romantic and platonic, were characterized by my agreeable nature. I was easygoing, understanding, never demanding. But beneath the surface, a quiet resentment simmered. The suppressed emotions didn't simply disappear, they festered, turning into a dull ache in my chest. I started to notice how much energy it took to maintain the facade, how exhausting it was to constantly monitor my words, my expressions, even my thoughts. The cracks began to show during a particularly challenging period at work. My boss, a demanding man, was unfairly criticizing my team. Every fiber of my being screamed to defend them, to speak up for what was right. But the familiar internal censor kicked in. "Don't cause trouble," it whispered. "Don't be difficult." I watched silently as my colleagues were berated, feeling a profound sense of helplessness and self-loathing. That night, I called David, expecting him to offer some comfort, some validation. Instead, he echoed the familiar refrain. "Willa, you know how bossy you can get when you're upset. Just try to keep a lid on it." His words, though not exactly the same as our parents', carried the same underlying message. It was then, in that moment of despair, that I realized the depth of their conditioning. It wasn't just about protecting me from becoming her. It was about protecting themselves from any disruption to their fragile peace. I was tired, exhausted. The weight of all those unsaid words, all those swallowed emotions, was becoming unbearable. It was like trying to hold back a rising tide with my bare hands. I started having vivid dreams, nightmares really, where my voice was gone, or where I tried to scream but no sound came out. The terror in those dreams was palpable, a reflection of the terror I felt in my waking life, of losing myself entirely. The facade was crumbling, and I knew deep down that something had to give. The growing unease was undeniable. A persistent hum that signaled a deeper change was on the horizon. The first whisper of defiance came unexpectedly, not in a grand confrontation, but in a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in my own perception. I started to really listen to what was being said to me, not just the words, but the underlying fear, the unspoken manipulation. My mother, in her usual subtle way, made a disparaging remark about a neighbor who had recently started a small business, calling her pushy and too loud. In the past, I would have nodded, maybe even agreed to avoid conflict. But this time, something in me snapped. Not outwardly, not yet. But internally. I saw the fear in her eyes, the judgment, and I realized it was a reflection of her own unfulfilled desires, her own suppressed ambitions. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I looked up Aunt Carol. It took some digging, but I found her. She was living in another state, a successful artist, her life vibrant and unapologetically her own. I scrolled through her online presence, seeing photos of her laughing, surrounded by friends, her art bold and expressive. There was no trace of the problematic woman my family had painted. Instead, there was a woman who seemed free. It was a revelation. The monster they had created in my mind was a phantom, a figment of their own anxieties. That realization was a small crack, but a significant one. It allowed a sliver of light to enter my carefully constructed world of silence. I started to challenge my own internal monologue, the one that parroted their accusations. When the voice in my head said, "Look who you're becoming," I started to ask, and what if that's a good thing? The shift wasn't dramatic, not at first. It was a subtle unraveling, a quiet reevaluation of everything I had been taught to believe about myself and my voice. The fear was still there, but now, a tiny spark of curiosity, of self-preservation, was beginning to flicker alongside it. The internal shift gained momentum, gradually preparing me for the external changes that were soon to follow. The true unveiling happened during a family holiday gathering, a forced assembly of relatives that always felt more like a performance than a reunion. My parents, David, and a smattering of aunts, uncles, and cousins were present. The conversation, as usual, was carefully curated, light and superficial. My uncle, a notoriously loud and opinionated man, began to loudly declare his views on a political topic, making sweeping generalizations that I knew to be false and harmful. In the past, I would have bitten my lip, looked at the floor, and waited for the uncomfortable silence to pass. But this time, as he spoke, I felt a familiar heat rise in my chest, but this time, it wasn't fear. It was righteous anger. A small voice, distinctly my own, whispered, "Enough." I took a deep breath, and before I could second-guess myself, I spoke. "Uncle John," I said, my voice clear and steady, "I respect your right to your opinion, but some of the things you're saying aren't accurate. In fact, studies show." A hush fell over the table. All eyes turned to me. My mother's face went pale, a flicker of that familiar dread in her eyes. David shifted uncomfortably. For a moment, the old fear threatened to swallow me whole. Then my mother spoke, her voice barely a whisper, yet audible in the sudden silence. "Willa," she began, "look who you're becoming." It was the same old accusation, the same old weapon. But this time it landed differently. It didn't pierce me. It bounced off. Because this time I wasn't afraid. I met her gaze, and for the first time in my life, I didn't back down. "Yes, Mom," I said, my voice gaining strength. "I am becoming someone. I'm becoming someone who speaks the truth, someone who stands up for what's right. And if that's a problem, then maybe it's not my problem." The words hung in the air, defiant and resolute. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't the silence of fear, but the silence of shock of a pattern broken. The ripple effect of my words began to spread slowly but surely, reshaping the landscape of our family dynamics. The aftermath of that holiday gathering was messy, as most true changes are. There were uncomfortable phone calls, attempts by my mother to talk sense into me, and a period of strained silence from my father. David was perhaps the most surprising. After a few weeks, he called, tentatively at first, then with a genuine tone. He admitted that he'd always felt the pressure too, the need to keep the peace. He even confessed that he admired my courage. It wasn't an instant reconciliation, but it was a beginning. My relationship with my parents is still evolving. They haven't entirely shed their old fears, and the phrase, "Look who you're becoming," still slips out occasionally, a ghost of their old power. But now, when it does, I don't shrink. I don't silence myself. I calmly, firmly explain my perspective or simply respond, "Yes, I am. And I'm proud of who I'm becoming." Sometimes they listen. Sometimes they don't. But the important thing is, I listen to myself. I've started setting boundaries, something I never dared to do before. I've learned to say no without guilt, to express my needs without apology. I even reached out to Aunt Carol. Our first conversation was tentative, filled with unspoken years, but it was also surprisingly warm. She was exactly as her online persona suggested, vibrant, intelligent, and fiercely independent. She laughed when I told her about my family's old accusation. "Look who you're becoming." "Willa," she said, her voice full of warmth, "that's the best compliment they could ever give you." It was liberating to finally connect with the woman they had demonized, to see that their fear was baseless, a reflection of their own limitations, not hers and certainly not mine. I no longer live in the suffocating quiet. My voice, once a whispered secret, is now a confident presence. The journey had been long and arduous, but the destination, a place of authenticity and strength, was finally within reach. Today my life is still quiet, but it's a chosen quiet, a peaceful silence that allows me to hear my own thoughts, my own desires. I'm no longer defined by the fear of who I might become, but by the joy of who I am. My relationships are richer, more authentic, because they are built on honesty, not on my ability to suppress myself. My parents still struggle with my newfound voice at times, but they are slowly, grudgingly learning to accept it. David and I have built a true sibling bond, one based on mutual respect and understanding. The key lesson I've learned is this: your voice is your most powerful tool, and no one has the right to silence it. True peace doesn't come from avoiding conflict, but from living authentically, even if it means ruffling a few feathers. It's a painful journey to unlearn years of conditioning, to shed the skin of silence, but it is unequivocally worth it. If you've been living in the shadows of someone else's fears, if you've been told who you shouldn't be, I implore you, find your voice. Speak your truth. Embrace the person you are becoming, because that person is uniquely, wonderfully you. Don't let anyone else define your worth or your identity. The world needs your voice. Are you ready to find it?